Okay, good evening everyone. I think we're going to make a start. So, my name is Max Delmar and I'm delighted to welcome you to our 2020 Cotterrell Lecture in Sociological Jurisprudence. This is a lecture series that's named in honour of our friend and colleague Roger Cotterrell, who's with us this evening, and together with his wife Anne. Thank you very much for being here. I wanted to begin by acknowledging that we're in the midst of an industrial dispute, where, as you know, not ourselves on strike this week, but I stand, and I know many of you stand, in solidarity with our friends and colleagues, those on the picket line in this weather, withdrawing their labour and resisting in other ways. Although there are specific issues in the dispute, I think it's fair to say that there's much more at stake, the very future of the university and academic way of life. I think we can resist, at least on days like this, on occasions like this, I think we can resist. We can resist the instrumentalization of our labour and our relations. We can resist the exploitation of all those who are desperately trying to make an academic life, pursuing a passion in research and teaching. But it's going to be a long fight. In any event, we host this event today very much in that spirit of solidarity and resistance. Given that, I'm even more delighted than I would normally be that our speaker this evening is Professor Renisa Mawani, as Professor of Sociology at the University of British Columbia. I say that for many reasons, but one of them is that one of the themes that has animated Renisa's work is precisely resistance. Some of you were present on Tuesday when we launched and discussed Renisa's second and prize-winning book, Across Oceans of Law. In it, Renisa tracks the movements of Gurjit Singh and Hussein Rahim and passengers on the Komagata Maru. Without idealizing these figures, for instance, Renisa shows how they too, along with colonial officials, although in different ways, deployed references to indigeneity to further their own interests. So without idealizing these figures, Renisa describes how they fought the British Empire in their own way, how they reimagined relations between land and sea, and space and time, and how they did so not only in speech and writing, but also, or very much so, with their bodies and movements. For example, as fugitives on land, as well as travellers on seas. Mindful always of the complexities of race, Renisa shows how they contested the whiteness of the oceans and the incapacity of all persons to move freely on them. And she shows us in that way how the oceans are very much not lawless spaces, but spaces filled with legally dense encounters. So Renisa has confronted head-on the difficulties, methodological, ethical, political, of writing about colonial subjects. She is sensitive both to the horrific ways that colonial power and racial violence, often through and with law, is brought to bear upon colonial subjects, but at the same time she does not treat them as passive victims, but rather as historical actors in their own right, full of willfulness and agency. And she tells these stories, she really beautifully tells these stories of the lives of these persons, their struggle, their creativity. She does this brilliantly in this book I mentioned, Across Oceans of Law, but really across her work in general. And I know I'm not the only one looking forward to her third book, which is currently in progress, called Enemies of Empire, which tells the stories of men, Gurjit Singh again, but also others, who started shipping companies and thus challenged the colonial regulation of the seas in the early to mid-20th century. One might ask, what are the stories of resistance at resisting? And here one would have to delve into how Renisa conceives of power and also the importance of knowledge as a mode of power. I'm not going to be able to do that, you'll be relieved to know, in great detail, but I do want to mention just a couple of things. If you're interested in colonial and imperial dimensions of the history of legal knowledge, there's really hardly a better place to go than Renisa's work. Renisa has consistently been sensitive to the materiality and aesthetics of knowledge, knowledge practices and knowledge forms, spaces of knowledge, movement of knowledge, and the many varieties of technologies of governance. In Across Oceans of Law, this includes ship manifests, ledger books, bills of lading, records of credit and debt, slave registries, and I think we might see some pictures later, many of which can be thought of as forms of law, and Renisa does think of them as forms of law. Renisa also writes about time, clocks and railways, longitude and ships as colonial, imperial, and indeed racial technologies. And she writes too about cultural and symbolic dimensions of colonial imperial legalities, such as naming. Naming is an interesting technology, knowledge, and gendered figuration of ships. This interest in knowledge and power, including how uneven they are, the entanglement of the discursive and the material, of taxonomy and pain, of statistics and death, of law and violence, is a long-standing interest, is long-standing in Renisa's work. For instance, it animates also her first book, Colonial Proximities, which examined colonial contact zones in late 19th and early 20th century British Columbia as spaces of racial intermixture. And there she placed the spotlight on other kinds of colonial knowledge practices, such as the use of the family tree metaphor, or the kinds of racial distinctions drawn not only by high-ranking authorities, but also police officers and low-level bureaucrats, as well as surveys, ethnography, legal codes, legal evidence. These, in Renisa's treatment, are epistemic technologies of state racisms, and that's state racisms in the plural, because it's an important part of her work to be sensitive to the contradictions and inconsistencies in racial regimes of power. I've not mentioned many other publications and achievements. For instance, her interest in the imperial history of animals. I'm really looking forward hugely to her forthcoming collection with Antoinette Burton called Animalia and Imperial Beastry for Our Times. And I've also hardly mentioned something that we talked a lot about on Tuesday, and that's her methodological creativity, the way she speaks of oceans as method. But I hope I've given you enough, or a little bit of a taste, to just how innovative and important her work is. You've not come to hear me speak, of course, and so without further ado, if you could join with me in inviting Renisa Mawani to give our 2020 Cotterrell lecture.
Okay. I'd like to begin by thanking Max and Professor Cotterrell for this wonderful opportunity, and Max for this really lovely introduction. I'm really honored and delighted to be here. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah, okay. So my talk today is situated in a kind of interval between my recent book, Across Oceans of Law, the Komagata Maru and Jurisdiction in the Time of Empire, and a new project titled Enemies of Empire. And I want to just start by sort of situating what I'm going to talk about in the parameters of this new project. So this new project initially began as a socio-legal history of piracy, and I wasn't interested in sort of thinking about pirates per se, but I was interested in thinking about the ways in which piracy had been used in the early 20th century as a way of maintaining Anglo-imperial control over the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And I was very interested, as Max said, in situating Gurdat Singh, who's pictured here, the charterer of the Komagata Maru, alongside Marcus Garvey. Both of these men started shipping lines, the Guru Nanak Steamship Company and the Black Star Line, respectively, with limited degrees of success. The British and US empires thwarted their entrepreneurial pursuits as threats to economy, monopoly, and the racial order of things. And as I researched Gurdat Singh, I was actually struck at how much allegations directed against him, allegations of corruption, fraud, and mismanagement, were also directed at Garvey. And so what I'm interested in doing in this wider project, and I'm still trying to figure it out because it keeps getting wider and wider and wider, is to think about the relationship between anti-colonialism and capitalism using these two figures and others. So the project is still very much on the horizon, but the reason why I say that it keeps expanding is that as I've been thinking about these figures and thinking about the relationship between entrepreneurial networks and anti-colonialism and a history of capitalism, I've also become very interested in the very large network of Sikh, Hindu, and Muslim men, especially from Punjab, but also from Gujarat, which is the province of my ancestry, who were merchants and business owners. Some were self-declared anti-colonials, and many were caught up in the juridical regimes of the Indian colonial state. These men were deemed enemies of empire not only because of their political sentiments and affiliations, but also on account of their economic ambitions. Many of these men traveled from Punjab and Gujarat to East and Southeast Asian ports of call, Rangoon, Bangkok, Kobe, Kuala Lumpur, and Hong Kong, among others. And my talk today focuses on 4 men from one Gujarati merchant family, Umair, Muhammad, Ismail, and Sidi Qasim. But before I get there, I'd like to say a little bit as to how my discussion of this past, specifically the years between 1914 and 1919, might speak to more recent events unfolding in India. So in October 2001, 1 month following the 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington, the Indian president of the time, K.R. Narayan, issued the Prevention of Terrorism Ordinance, also known by the acronym POTO. The ordinance was introduced and signed in haste with little opportunity for discussion or debate. Like its Western counterparts, and I'm thinking specifically of the US, Canada, the UK, but there are many others, the Indian government justified its new terrorism provisions as a necessary response to growing global threats. India's tense relationship with Pakistan and with its own Muslim minorities made the ordinance ever more crucial to national security, according to the government. POTO granted special powers to law enforcement and security agencies, allowing them, among other things, the ability to detain anyone suspected of terrorism on the basis of suspicion and without any formal charge. Ultimately, POTO did not have large-scale support and was rejected the following year. On March 28, 2002, POTO was rescinded and replaced by the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And although the act was repealed in 2004, many of its coercive elements have since been folded into the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, its provisions only fortified since the 2008 terror attacks in Bombay and more recently in the Anti-Citizenship Amendment Act protests. So on October 2nd, 2019, the Indian Parliament passed the Unlawful Activities Prevention Amendment Bill. Amit Shah, Minister of Home Affairs, appealed to the House to pass the bill unanimously. In so doing, India would, quote, send a strong message to the world that terrorists are enemies of humanity, and India is committed to finish terror from its soil, Shah declared. Under the Act, Indian citizens can be declared terrorists and their property can be seized. And as we've witnessed in recent Anti-Citizenship Amendment Bill protests, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Amendment Bill has been used to arrest protesters. Perhaps the most visible of these arrests has been the case of Akhil Gogoi, the advisor to Assam's farmers organization. He was arrested under the act and has commenced an indefinite hunger strike, which was to begin March 1st. It's important to note, I think, that in his appeal for support for the Unlawful Activities Prevention Amendment Bill, Shah describes terrorists to be enemies of humanity. And what I'm suggesting is that we think of enemies as empire historically. So as I've already mentioned, my talk is not about the Prevention of Terrorism Ordinance, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, or the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. But what interests me is its colonial precedents. The Unlawful Activities Prevention Act was derived partially from the Prevention of Terrorism Ordinance. Under the Indian Constitution, ordinances are only to be signed by presidents in emergency situations that demand immediate and urgent attention. But as Shubh Mukherjee points out, ordinances in India are neither exceptional or limited. They have become convenient and even preferred forms of legislative action, especially against the perceived threats of terrorism, whether global or local, from outside or from within. Although ordinances were intended to be a special constitutional arrangement, they've been normalized and routinized as a necessary lever in India's juridical regime. So there's little doubt that the Prevention of Terrorism Ordinance, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and the newly amended Unlawful Activities Prevention Act have granted sweeping powers to India's law enforcement and security forces. Yet it's important to remember that these acts are not unprecedented. The roots can be traced to colonial rule. Under the British Raj, ordinances granted the Indian colonial government one avenue for expanding its powers over enemies of empire. The Foreigners Ordinance and the Ingress into India Ordinance, both issued in 1914 and which are the subject of my paper today, afforded unlimited powers to Indian police and magistrates, granting them the authority to arrest, apprehend, and detain anyone arriving in India and suspected of seditious and anti-British sentiments. These ordinances unleashed a coercive and violent expression of state power that clearly echoes India's response to dissent and insurgency today. And while many scholars have discussed India's emergency legislation, I'm thinking specifically of Radhika Singha, the late Nasser Hussain, and more recently Yael Burda, few have examined the Foreigners Ordinance and the Ingress into India Ordinance. Even fewer have considered the role of the sea. So what I'm suggesting is that India's history of ordinances, particularly the ones that I'm talking about, emerged and developed from maritime contests over commerce, migration, and anti-colonialism that were expanded to movements on land. Let me briefly explain. So in 1861, the Indian colonial government passed the Export of Saltpeter Ordinance, which was India's first ordinance. Whereas acts originate in Parliament, a government department or municipal body signs ordinances, often with little discussion or deliberation. In the case of saltpeter, Canning, India's Governor General, introduced the ordinance which prohibited the transport of saltpeter from any of Her Majesty's territories in India, except aboard British ships bound for London or Liverpool. After this ordinance was signed, the following week it was replaced with the Export of Saltpeter Ordinance 1862. The second ordinance remained largely the same, except that it allowed saltpeter exports to all British ports, not only London and Liverpool. So saltpeter is a natural mineral resource commonly known as potassium nitrate and is used in the production of gunpowder. India has long been a rich and abundant source. In the 16th and 17th centuries, European empires, the Portuguese, but also the Dutch and the British, struggled with Indian rulers to impose control. As gunpowder increasingly became a valuable military commodity, interest in saltpeter increased not only among Europeans, but also in the so-called New World. Between 1601 and 1801, James Frey notes, European ships made thousands of voyages from Asian ports to European cities, Amsterdam, London, Copenhagen, Lisbon, and Stockholm. 16% of their cargo space, or 452.8 meters, consisted of saltpeter. It's important to note that the 1861 and 1862 ordinances were a direct response to a maritime conflict between Britain and the American states. When the American Civil War began, Queen Victoria declared a policy of neutrality, but the Confederate States wanted diplomatic recognition and sent 2 envoys on a British mail packet called the Trent. This was intercepted and the envoys were arrested. And according to Britain, the interception and arrests were seen as an act of aggression. Britain responded with a ban on saltpeter exports. The export of saltpeter effectively granted Britain a monopoly by prohibiting transport from any of Her Majesty's Indian territories except aboard British ships. Given the growing importance of gunpowder and the significance of saltpeter in its production, the ordinance only escalated tensions between the American state and the British government. Ordinances in India, which moved from exception to rule, emerged out of this inter-imperial maritime contest over commodities, shipping, and control of the sea. So the introduction of ordinances in India began at a slow pace. From 1861 to 1914, the Indian colonial government signed 7 ordinances, but with the onset of World War I, this dramatically changed, and we see from this table here, between 1914 and 1915, in the span of only 1 year, the Indian colonial government passed a total of 12 ordinances. Included among these was the Foreigners Ordinance and the Ingress into India Ordinance. The Ingress was the response to another maritime contest, this one between India, Canada, and Britain. The Ingress into India Ordinance was hastily signed in anticipation of the arrival of the Komagata Maru. The voyage, as Max said in his introduction, is the focus of my book, which we discussed earlier this week. But for those of you who weren't there, just to give you a little bit of context, in March 1914, Gurdat Singh, an entrepreneur and aspiring seafarer from Malaya, chartered the Japanese ship in Hong Kong. His interests in the ship were twofold: to initiate or to determine or to gauge his commercial aspirations. So he planned to initiate the Guru Nanak Steamship Company, and the Komagata Maru's journey was to serve as a test voyage. But the 1914 passage was also intended to challenge the racial restrictions imposed on Indian migrants traveling within the British Empire and to the Dominion of Canada more specifically. The ship's trans-Pacific passage from Hong Kong to Vancouver and then to Calcutta engendered and intensified global circuits of violence, law, and radicalism that connected the Pacific and Indian Oceans and laid the conditions for the Foreigners' Ordinance and the Ingress into India Ordinance. And what I find really interesting is that although border regulations in the 19th and early 20th century have commonly been identified with white settler colonies, the Foreigners' Ordinance and the Ingress into India Ordinance suggests that the Indian colonial government was also very concerned with policing borders by regulating the entry of foreigners and nationals alike. These ordinances were to assist authorities in identifying, apprehending, and arresting seditionists and anti-colonials seeking re-entry into the subcontinent, especially during the Great War. So for Indian colonial authorities, the Komagata Maru's anticipated arrival on the Hooghly River proved to be an emergency that demanded new legal mechanisms. In response to the arrival of a ship full of suspected anti-colonials, agitators, and criminals under the leadership of Gurdat Singh, the Indian colonial government proposed the Ingress into India Ordinance, which was signed by Lord Hardinge in September 1914. The Ingress was explicitly linked to the Foreigners' Ordinance, which had been passed 1 week earlier. The Ingress was to be read with the Foreigners' Ordinance, authorities explained, so as to regulate and restrict the liberty of persons entering British India. Though these ordinances were a direct response to the Komagata Maru and to fears of escalating sedition and anti-colonial activities, the ordinances were justified through the onset of World War I. The existence of a state of war with the empires of Germany and Austria-Hungary has rendered it essential to adopt precautionary measures to maintain the internal security of India, one authority wrote. Indian authorities insisted that additional legal measures were necessary to maintain the sanctity and security of British rule in India. So whereas the Foreigners' Ordinance was aimed at controlling the entry and exit of all aliens into India, the Ingress was to curtail the mobility of Indian nationals entering British India, whether by land or sea, to protect the state from danger of anything prejudicial to its safety, interest, or tranquility. The Ingress, one Minute paper claimed, on account of general grounds appertaining to a state of war, was enacted on general grounds appertaining to a state of war. It was not a response to local or internal threats of sedition, but sedition and anti-colonialism is what inspired both the Foreigners' Ordinance and the Ingress into India Ordinance, and especially the arrival of the Komagata Maru. So the Ingress was passed 17 days before the Komagata Maru's expected arrival to Calcutta. As conditions at sea made it difficult to predict when a vessel would enter port, and the Komagata Maru didn't actually have a radio, the Ingress was to be applied retroactively against any Indian national arriving on the subcontinent after September 5th. At a high mark of Indian radicalism in India and abroad, the Ingress was designed to control the movements of returning emigrants of the Ghadar persuasion. And as many of you may know, the Ghadars were a militant Indian diasporic and anti-colonial movement that operated from the west coast of North America and advocated for the violent overthrow of British rule. The Ingress granted Indian authorities unprecedented powers to govern the movements of returning migrants in the face of what they perceived to be significant threat. It authorized local police to search, register, arrest, and detain anyone suspected of endangering national security. District magistrates could prevent an individual's intercourse and communication with any class of prohibited persons. Suspects could be confined to their villages and required to make daily appearances before a supervising officer. Imprisonment was indefinite and release was pending inquiry. So the Komagata Maru's arrival in Calcutta radically altered India's security regime. Although the use of the ordinances alongside legislation, including the Defense of India Act, for example, through the use of ordinances, The ship's arrival extended imperial surveillance across land and sea, granting authorities the power to search incoming ships and arriving passengers, and paving the way for legal responses to future threats to national security, however amorphous and ambiguous, whether perceived or real. So the ingress was expansive in its geographical reach. It applied to all nationals entering the whole of British India and Burma by land or sea. To maintain their quasi-autonomy, the ordinance could not be used against persons entering through the princely states, provided they didn't arrive from a foreign country. Everyone who entered after September 1914 was to register with police or a district magistrate. Reports were to include name, parentage, and present residence of such persons, the date of arrival, and the country from which he has come. The district magistrate held the authority to detain, search, and register such persons, and to restrict the movements of such persons to such a place or places as may seem necessary, and to require such persons to give security for this compliance with such restrictions. If the person in question was deemed to be a threat to public safety or the state, the Chief Commissioner could confine or intern the person in such a manner and for such a period as the Chief Commissioner may deem expedient. Although the ingress was only enforceable against Indian nationals, foreignness was its governing logic. The ingress is another instance of emergency legislation, 1 Minute Paper explained. It gives power in the interests of the state to treat persons in British India in the same manner as foreigners, even though they are not foreigners in fact, in regard to restriction of their liberty and the other matters dealt with in the Foreigners' Ordinance 1914. The ingress into India Ordinance shall be construed with and deemed to be part of the Foreigners' Ordinance of 1914. So we see this real interconnection between the two ordinances. They're passed together, they make reference to each other, they're supposed to be read together, and in various places, authorities actually used the Foreigners' Ordinance and not the Ingress into India Ordinance in their efforts to apprehend suspects and supposed seditionists. So in Burma, for example, authorities relied on the Foreigners' Ordinance to arrest and detain Indians and not on the ingress. The definition of foreigner or foreign made things even more confusing. So the Foreigners' Ordinance was to be applied against non-nationals, but also to persons not being foreigners. Although the ingress could not prohibit Indians from re-entering India, fears of sedition, criminality, and dangerousness granted authorities expansive powers to govern recent arrivals as though they were foreigners with limited rights in their own land. And this, I think, will become clearer in the case of the Qasim brothers. So positioned along the eastern and western Indian Ocean regions, officials insisted that India was vulnerable to threats of sedition and anti-colonialism from abroad. Gurdat Singh and the Komagata Maru passengers were described to be revolutionary forces. Although some passengers were Ghadar affiliates, and upon arriving in Calcutta, the magistrate and police officers did find some Ghadar materials, many were actually not. But perceived threats of insurgency and anti-coloniality centered maritime governance as crucial to the enforcement of India's emergency ordinance. Shipping companies and their representatives were recruited into expanding systems of surveillance. Shipping companies were asked to provide details regarding the arrival of ships and the character of those aboard. Indian colonial officials also informed steamship companies of the new restrictions on entry. Under the Foreigners' Ordinance, steamers were prohibited from taking aliens to ports other than Calcutta, Madras, or Rangoon. If alien friends, and this included Belgians or Dutch, are booked to Bombay, Karachi, or other ports other than those named above, one memo cautioned, without special authorization, they will meet with difficulty on arrival. Steamship owners and operators were warned that such bookings should not take place, and to enter ports of call that were not listed on the permitted list without special permission was punishable by fines and imprisonment. As the Foreigners' Ordinance and the Ingress into India Ordinance were directly connected and officials could not always determine who counted as a foreigner, they produced a series of new legal categories: aliens, alien enemies, and alien friends. The ordinances also made reference to a new type of prisoner, the detainees. Under the orders of government, they are The detainees is excluded from jail statistics, and their maintenance cost is shown separately. Amrita Bazar Patrika, one of the oldest daily newspapers in Calcutta, reported that in January 1916, there were only 8 prisoners designated as detainees in the city, but by the end of 1916, this number grew to 288. As emergency legislation, the Ingress into India Ordinance and the Foreigners Ordinance were to have a short lifespan. They were supposed to expire 6 months after the end of the war. But given the ongoing and escalating fears of Indian radicalism on the subcontinent, in Burma, Asian ports, the west coast of North America, and beyond, the Foreigners Ordinance and the Ingress into India Ordinance remained in effect for 7 years. The Indian colonial government used them forcefully and vigorously. Between 1915 and 1916, and in Punjab alone, over 3,000 men were imprisoned and were restricted to their villages without charge. The Ingress was used to detain anyone suspected of anti-British activities, irrespective of whether these suspicions had any legitimate basis. Indefinite detention was justified and rationalized in the broadest possible terms. Indian men thought to be associating with the Ghaddars or believed to be Ghaddar sympathizers were imprisoned and detained, often for years. But the Ingress was not only used in Punjab. In 1919, 1,800 men and 183 women were to be released from prison in Madras, and 7,200 men and 78 women were to have their sentences reduced. In December 1919, under the Ingress, 42 people in Bengal were confined to their homes, and another 2,154 were placed under minor restrictions. So we see that this is a very expansive regime of colonial surveillance. But what I've presented so far are abstractions. Clearly, the Foreigners Ordinance and the Ingress into India Ordinance had an expansive temporal and geographical reach. But how did they work? How did they affect the lives of men, and they were mostly men, albeit not exclusively, who came within their reach? And what I'd like to do now is to examine these questions in a more micro register. As we'll see in the remainder of my talk, these emergency ordinances were aimed widely, not only at migrants, but also merchants, not only in Punjab, but also Gujarat, not only within India, but also Burma and Siam. The Ingress into India Ordinance and the Foreigners Ordinance were interpreted together in ways that separated and devastated families and shattered economic futures. So for the time I have left, I want to turn to the case of Sidi Ismail Umar and Muhammad Qasim, who were part of a merchant family from Jetpur, Gujarat, and who had been living in Siam and Burma for 10 to 15 years. These men were transformed from nationals into foreigners through incarceration and deportation, but let me first set the scene. For the Indian colonial government, the Siam-Burma border had long been a site of anti-colonial radicalism. According to recent evidence presented in the Lahore conspiracy case and the Mandalay Special Tribunal, certain revolutionaries, 3 at least from Canada, collected in Bangkok and engaged in a plot to invade India by way of Burma. Leading up to World War I, authorities feared that German influences were also present in the region. There is ample evidence, wrote the Sedition Committee in its report of 1918, that the Ghaddar Party in America, in conjunction with the Germans, intended to train Sikhs returning to India to use arms in places along the railway which has been built in northern Siam in the direction of Burma, largely by German engineers and Punjabi workmen, and to foment rebellion by Indian troops and military police. These supposed Indian radicals, in collaboration with German influencers, planned to stir up mutiny among the military forces, so as to overthrow the British government. In the early 20th century, Burma's population was enumerated at 12 million. These included 8 million Burmese, 3 million frontier tribes, and 1 million immigrants. Of those deemed immigrants, 400,000 were Hindus, 400,000 were Muslims, and 120,000 were Chinese. So it's interesting to even see how the report enumerates foreigners as Hindus, Muslims, and Chinese. The Muslims living in Rangoon, like the Qasim brothers, were mostly merchants from Gujarat. But according to Indian officials, these men were involved in anti-colonial activities. There was thought to be a close connection between the Mohammedans and the Ghaddar plotters in Burma, the Sedition Committee report stated. In their account to the Indian colonial government, the commissioners routinely collapsed Muslim and Ghaddar. The Muslim Ghadar plotters at Rangoon, the committee reported, are known to have planned a rising on the occasion of Bakri Eid in October 1915, when English were to be killed instead of cows and goats. On account of these concerns, authorities in Burma and Siam used the Defence of India Act, the Foreigners Act, and the Ingress into India Ordinance in efforts to quell seditious activities. The chief conspirators, including the Mohammedans, were interned, local authorities explained. Since then, there has been no trouble in Burma. In 1917, Sadiq Qasim and his three brothers, who are residing in Burma and Siam, found themselves at the center of heightened concerns about radicalism, insurgency, and mutiny. So, Sadiq Qasim, who came to be known to authorities as Sidi Qasim, was a 21-year-old Surti Muslim merchant, a native of Jetpur in Kathiawar, which was part of the princely state of Gujarat. Sidi went first to Rangoon, where he lived with his elder brother Umar. Then he went to Watif, where he stayed with his older brothers Muhammad and Ismail. Sidi and his three brothers all followed their father to Burma, where he sold cloth. Muhammad arrived at the age of 22, Ismail at the age of 15, and Umar at the age of 12 to 13. They were shopkeepers and had a branch, one branch in Siam and another in Burma. Sidi lived for 7 years and Wathit, and then obtained a passport to travel to Mahang Son, where he ran the family shop. After moving, Sidi said he lost touch with his brothers. He had no business partner and no friends, only a coolie by the name of Fakir. The business was successful. Sidi was making 1,000 rupees a month. In 1915, authorities received reports that the brothers were disaffected and their unrestricted freedom on the border of Siam and Burma was a source of great danger. Others reported that the brothers were associating with known Ghadars. According to the Criminal Intelligence Department in Bombay, Sohan Lal and his party came over on their Ghadar mission. Muhammad Qasim, who was believed to be living in Burma, allegedly put a room at their disposal in Mahang Son, which they occupied for some 15 days. It was their last jumping point before British territory was reached. According to Bombay authorities, there's little doubt that Muhammad and Ismail knew the real character of their guests. On September 15, 1917, Muhammad, Ismail, and Umar were all arrested under the Foreigners' Ordinance. Sidi had already been arrested 1 month earlier in August 1917. Oh, sorry, I missed that. That's his voyage from Jetpur to Siam. Due to fears of radicalism in Siam, he was immediately deported to Burma and imprisoned in the Mulmain district jail. When he was questioned by local authorities, Sidi claimed to have no idea why he was arrested. He says, "I was told that my arrest was ordered by the consul of Chiang Mai, but I don't know for what offense." Sidi described himself to be a well-known and well-respected merchant. "I know the governor very well, and he knows all about me and my business." The governor regularly visited Sidi's store, and Sidi occasionally visited the governor's house to show him his wares. Despite their acquaintance, however, the governor arrested him under the Foreigners' Ordinance and for reasons that were unknown to Sidi. Recall that under India's new ordinances, suspects did not need to be charged with any specific offense. They could be arrested just by way of suspicion. Officials in Rangoon described Sidi to be the leader of the local Indians, over whom he was believed to exercise a harmful influence. According to one authority, Sidi Qasim is a leading trader in Mahang Son and has considerable influence among Indians in this frontier town. Mr. Wilson of the Bombay-Burma Trading Corporation was also asked to comment on Sidi's character and said that he carried correspondence on behalf of seditionists, and his brothers, now interned in Burma, were plainly intimate with the seditionist party. Others described Sidi as thoroughly anti-British. He spreads false rumors regarding British action in Mecca and elsewhere, and declares on the border that the British war news published in the Siamese papers is false. He was deported from Siam to Burma because it was felt that there could be little control over his action in that country. He was to be confined in the Mulmain jail, for it would not be safe for him to remain at large in Burma, authorities insisted, where he would, without any real difficulty, open correspondence with and actively assist seditionists in Siam. All of the brothers, save for Muhammad and Ismail, were sent to different prisons. Umair was confined in Fort Stedman and Sidi in Moulmein. Although Muhammad and Ismail were thought to be the least dangerous of the four, they were imprisoned in the Mingyan jail as a measure of precaution. 1 month after the men were detained, the superintendent of the jail wrote as follows: "The detainee Muhammad is really ill and is really going downhill fast. His further confinement in the jail, in my opinion, is likely to cause his death." But the brothers remained in prison, and in November 1918, authorities reported once again that confinement was having a deleterious effect on the health of the two men. Muhammad was likely to die if he remained in jail. There was nothing specific causing the poor health of the brothers, but the unsatisfactory state of health, especially Muhammad's, was due to long confinement, anxiety about their financial affairs, and unknown condition of their wives and children, the superintendent reported. Muhammad and Ismail were released in December 1918 and kept under surveillance in Mingyan. Burmese authorities asked that they be returned to Jetpur, but local authorities in the Bombay presidency disagreed. "So far as I know," wrote the superintendent of police, "we in Kathiawar are more or less free from the anti-British craze, and I think it unwise to have men holding anti-British views back in native states for the present, especially in states where no immediate European supervision is possible." By January 1919, Muhammad, Umair, and Ismail were finally sent home to Jetpur via steamer and rail. 3 months later, Sidi joined them. All three brothers were required to provide 1,000 rupees as a surety. Remember, this is what Sidi made in a full month from his trade. But Umair was unable to secure the funds. He had no movable or immovable property. He had been away from Jetpur for 15 years and had lost touch with his relatives during this time. Umair was then to be detained in the Taluka jail. In October 1919, the brothers wrote a heartbreaking letter to the political agent of Kathiawar to try and retrieve their money and property from Mehangsan. "We have been ruined by this action of the government under the Foreigners' Ordinance, and our family members are practically starving, especially owing to the high costs of living. We have always been and shall always remain loyal to the British government," they assured, "and have never done anything by words or deeds against the interests of the benign British government." Their arrest, they insisted, was only the outcome of backbiting of the rival traders at Mehangsan. Fakir, Sidi's so-called coolie, had their money and property there, and they were asking to go to Mehangsan or to get their property and money from him. "We have been suffering a great deal through a want of money. We would like the government to allow our said man, Fakir Muhammad Osman, to pass money to us through the Bombay-Burma Trading Company," which of course was one of the sources that linked Sidi and his brothers to Ghutters and seditionists. On December 31st, 1919, Bombay authorities instructed the superintendent of Jetpur to remove all restrictions that were placed on the Qasim brothers, and their sureties returned. But they could not claim their money or their property from either Burma or Siam. Clearly, the effects of the Foreigners' Ordinance in the Ingress were devastating for the Qasim brothers. The family lost their business. Muhammad and Ismail were reported to be in ill health. Sidi Qasim spent almost 2 years in prison and then another 8 months under surveillance in Jetpur. But the most tragic effects were on Umair. At 27 years old, he had spent 15 years in Burma and was married there. His wife and child were both deceased. He had no money and no property. It is after an absence of about 15 years that he, Umair, has returned to Jetpur, Armchand Shah, the superintendent of police, reported, and he is almost a stranger or a foreigner here. Given the exceptional circumstances of World War I, the Foreigners' Ordinance and the Ingress were to remain in effect until the close of the war. However, they were not repealed until 1921. Importantly, their expiration coincided with Gurdat Singh's arrest. The ordinances could not reach their expiration before being marshaled against the object of their creation, which was Singh. The ordinances were not repealed until Gurdat Singh was captured, detained, and punished. So let me very quickly conclude. In an article published 1 year after the 9/11 attacks, Zygmunt Bauman argues that 9/11 marked a symbolic end to the era of space. So Bauman's not suggesting that space is no longer relevant, but that places no longer protect, however strongly they're armed and fortified. What Bauman highlights in this article is what he terms, and what he's been so famous for, liquid modernity, a space of constant movement where threats are always in motion, manifested in the bodies of refugees and terrorists, bodies that are often collapsed in a post-9/11 world. In this space of movement, he contends, those accused cannot confront their accusers as they have not yet been charged with anything. What is remarkable in Bauman's argument is the tone of newness. What he calls a planetary frontierland is marked by the ongoing threat of global terrorism and unprecedented global response, including a plethora of anti-terrorism laws, which included India's Prevention of Terrorism Ordinance and Prevention of Terrorism Act. Bauman's embrace of liquidity is metaphorical. However, the newness he ascribes to a world of perceived global danger is problematized when we think of this fluidity as material. The legacy of India's terrorism legislation, we might remember, are preceded by ordinances that emerged from the liquidity of the ocean, contests over ships, commodities, migration, and concerns of sedition. These ordinances were used to police land and sea borders, often with devastating effects, as the case of the Qasim brothers remind us. And this is a clear and important context to the insurgency and perceived sedition that's happening in India today. Thank you.
It's both informative and moving, I think, to hear about experiences of the man described. So we have about 10, 15 minutes for questions. While you're gathered, Anne, please, go ahead.
Surprised how little popular resistance there is to some of the current restrictions in Britain, and I wondered whether generally in India, through the newspapers and other means, there was a lot of opposition vocalised in relation to this ordinance.
Absolutely. So the newspapers were a really important place of public discussion and debate, not only in India, but also in the Indian diaspora. So I'm thinking of Gandhi's Indian Opinion, for example, where there was a lot of condemnation of not just the Komagata Maru, but also the restrictions that resulted via the Ingress into India Ordinance and the Foreigners Ordinance. I think that's definitely, and one of the slides that I had an image from one of the Indian newspapers that actually publicized the Ingress into India Ordinance, a week before it was signed. So I think there was much more public discussion and debate in that period. I don't want to say than there is now. I think that there are different forums for debate, certainly about the regulations and restrictions on movement and mobility.
Renisa, can I ask you something? You mentioned that the powers that the colonial government acquired as a result of these ordinances were unprecedented. Could you say a little bit about what happened or how unprecedented they were under the East India Company, for example, some of the emergency powers there? How much of a scaling up was this?
Yeah, I think I should clarify and say that unprecedented in terms of the actual British, like the Crown, right? So many of these emergency sort of mechanisms existed under the East India Company and were certainly folded into the governing regimes that were put in place after.
Yeah, it's difficult to know when to stop going back, isn't it? Please.
So I'm sure you already know this, but according to the caste system, traveling across the sea was considered to be something that brought impurity to you. So a lot of the Brahmin castes and even the trading castes, the Vaishya castes, never engaged in trade. Also because of the contact with what were called the Mlechas from outside. So have you found anything about the caste histories of these migrations especially with Gurdit Singh. From Punjab, a lot of lowered caste people were traveling across the sea at this point. So is there anything you found in the archive?
Well, on the Komagata Maru itself, most of the passengers were, of course, Sikh, but there were also 12 Hindus and 25 Muslims. And there I haven't actually been able to locate very much information about the Hindus that were on the ship, but there were very specific sort of spaces for the Sikhs and the Muslims to cook their food, even though they were in close contact with one another. So there was a committee that oversaw the provisions and the distribution of food, for example, aboard the ship, and also an advisory sort of committee to Gurdit Singh, and those committees were comprised of Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs. So it's difficult, I haven't been able to actually find anything about the kinds of caste distinctions that existed or how they played out on the ship, except to know that there was very sort of clear separation in terms of where people cooked food and where people slept, even though, during other sort of daily routines, they often engaged with one another. There was a gurdwara on the ship in one of the cabins, and all of the passengers were invited to come to the gurdwara. And it was unclear as to whether, these were religious sermons or whether they were political speeches. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There were very clear restrictions on upper caste, on Hindus and especially upper caste Hindus. But I haven't been able to find anything in the materials that I've been looking at.
Can I ask you a method question? Because it is an interesting feature of your work that there's this relationship between the micro and the macro. I mean, it's not like today you spent a lot of time on the micro story. I'm wondering how you come to choose the stories that you focus on. It's not easy, must be not easy to make that choice. And are you always, when you do that, make that choice, have one eye on the relations between the micro and the theme and the macro, the things you want to bring out?
Well, I always start with the micro, so which is why, as I told you, as I warned you a few days ago, that this talk was going to be very empirical, because my focus is always really on the kinds of on the sort of records, on the people that I'm following, and oftentimes, for example. The two Qasim brothers were in prison with a young Hindu man from Bengal, and he actually dies while he's in prison, which is one of the reasons why I think they're so concerned about the health of these two men. And this man's father writes, is petitioning the government to provide some kind of compensation, because this was the only person who actually worked in their family. And it was only, because I was doing research around these four brothers that I actually came across this particular account. And so I do always start with the micro and then sort of expand. And oftentimes I don't know where I'm going to end up. There's this wonderful quote that is in the introduction. It's translated in the introduction to the hermeneutics of the subject, where Foucault talks about the essay, and the essay is not a place for you to say everything you know or to show the world everything you know, but it's this whole sort of process of questioning everything you know, and that's really how I approach my work.
That's a wonderful description of it. Really. Do we have any other questions? David.
Thank you for your interesting talk. I'm sure it's obvious to you, but it's not to me afterwards, whether what you're asking us to see in these stories is an overreaction or just the normal everyday wickedness of empire. In other words, are these people that you're telling us actually involved in trying to do something? Or, as you sometimes said, we're innocent, we're just being mistreated? And does that make a difference? Is that question something that interests you, to want to know whether they really were, in any sense, enemies?
Yeah, I'm really interested in, so there's been a lot of work done on the Ghaddars, on Indian anti-colonials, but I'm actually really interested in the merchants that sort of get caught up in these legal regimes. And I think part of what interested me about the Komagata Maru was that Gurdat Singh was actually described in very positive terms by authorities in Malaya, where he lived and where he was a planter and an auctioneer. And it was only after he decided to charter a steamship that he suddenly rose to, prominence as this kind of anti-colonial figure. So I'm really interested in thinking about enemies of empire through commerce and trade, not necessarily as sort of political figures or politicized figures, but thinking about the ways in which their sort of economic pursuits were what was really the concern for the British Empire. So it's not about, the empire is wicked, all empires are, but I'm really interested in these traders, right, and how they get caught into this, whether they're, we can see similar sorts of accusations operating in different places, even under sort of soon after 9/11, if you actually provided any kind of financial support to Muslim-based organizations, that could be seen as, some kind of sympathy for terrorism, right? So I'm interested in sort of these economic networks primarily, and not so much the political figures, but how these economic figures become politicized through concerns about monopolies, commodities, and movements.
So it's hypocrisy, really. They really were not against them because they were a political threat, because they were an economic threat.
Yeah. Or we might see the two as inseparable.
Roger.
I'm quite interested in the economics of the actual voyage of the ship, it must have cost a lot of money to charter it and then to take the voyage. So, was he quite wealthy, or was he just trying to cover everything by the charges he was making on the passengers? If it was the latter, then presumably they were fairly well-to-do people, I would imagine, because it would have cost quite a lot to travel.
So Gurdat Singh had, he had a small-scale plantation in Saranda, and as I mentioned, was an auctioneer. But he was also trying for many months to try to, he was putting ads in Punjabi papers to try to get investors for this voyage, even before he had a ship, and he was unsuccessful. And then he decided that he was going to charge passengers 20 pounds or 200 Hong Kong dollars, and again was circulating advertisements in local newspapers in Asian port cities, but also in India, to try to recruit people to come. And some passengers were scared away because the ship was actually detained in Hong Kong before it was allowed to begin its passage, but other people were deliberately barred from actually accessing their funds. So in Shanghai, when the ship was docked, the banks were closed and people were not actually allowed to withdraw any money because authorities didn't want this voyage to be successful. And Gurdat Singh borrowed money, he bought coal. The people on the other side in Vancouver raised a very large amount of money, both in terms of property and cash, and these still weren't able to take over the charter. And then by the end of this whole event, Gurdat Singh ends up being really impoverished and is still trying to recover his funds and making appeals and filing cases against the Indian colonial government as a result, but is unsuccessful. So the charter was, I think, 11,000 Hong Kong dollars a month, and so it was a lot of money. And he was really, all of his ambitions were thwarted by authorities in India, in Hong Kong, and in Canada.
Roxanne.
Thank you. This was lovely. So I'm very intrigued by your interest in commercial activity and then saying that you want to trace how that commercial activity gets entangled into a political project. But I wonder, who reads the boundary of that distinction in our materials, aside from you as the examiner of materials? So is it that Singh sort of defends himself by saying, I'm just engaged in commercial activity? Do the prosecutors then look at this as explicitly political propaganda as opposed to commercial material, commercial activity? So I'm wondering which actors in this story think about the boundaries between a commercial and a political project?
That's a great question. So of course there's me as the analyst, but these boundaries are constantly being disputed and undermined and transgressed. In the commission of inquiry that's appointed after the ship arrives back in Calcutta, the argument is that Gurdat Singh had absolutely no commercial ambitions at all, that he was really being fraudulent, that he was essentially trafficking people, knowing full well that they wouldn't get in. He was, extorting money from them, and so on and so forth. And he described himself as, as a commercial agent or a business person, and that he had these ambitions to start this steamship company, and he would own 4 ships. And, and it was actually quite, there was a lot of evidence to support his claims. He even had tickets that said Guru Nanak Steamship Company, for example. And many of the other passengers really just saw him as providing a means to make a voyage that he, and that he wasn't engaged in any kind of political activities. So there are these sort of competing accounts of him. In the case of the Qasim brothers, it's not entirely clear to me, other than, they're associated with the Ghaddars, what exactly authorities see them as doing wrong. But it is quite significant that they have 2 family businesses, right? One in Burma, one in Siam, and possibly a third in another city. And one of them is making 1,000 rupees a month. Given that CD is actually engaged with the governor, that he goes and shows him his cloth, and all of these things, I think there is sufficient evidence to believe their accounts that they were in fact operating as merchants and caught up in concerns about competition and so on and so forth. And I should also say that in my response earlier, I said that it's often difficult to divide the commercial or the economic and the political. One of the things that Gurdat Singh was certainly trying to do was to reclaim a longer history of Indian shipbuilding and a longer sort of maritime history in India. That India had this very illustrious past, and that this essentially had been undermined and arrested since the arrival of the British, and given their attempts to create monopolies over shipping and so on and so forth. So it is really hard to sort of draw the distinction between what is the political and what is the commercial and the economic. And I guess one of the larger questions that I really want to think about is, what do these figures tell us about the relationship between the history of anti-colonialism and capitalism? Because we tend to think of anti-colonialism as anti-capitalism, and we don't often think about the ways in which people who are engaged in commercial pursuits might actually be engaged in a kind of anti-colonialism. And I think that's very evident in Gridet's saying and also in Marcus Garvey, which is probably why I was drawn so much to both of them.
Thank you. It's a wonderful question, and we look forward to I imagine you'll be treating it in your book on Enemies of Empire. And this was a wonderful link, I thought, also between your work in Across Oceans of Law and what you're working on now. So thank you very much. We have some wine waiting us outside, but before that, can you join with me in thanking me?